Easter Sunday, 1985, and several hundred of us, mainly armed with Japanese cameras, have turned out to photograph a couple of old steam locomotives, one of them the King George V, built nearly 60 years ago. The idea is for them to pull a train from Bristol to Plymouth to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the founding of the Great Western Railway. It's raining. At British Rail's Bath Road depot at Bristol, the raindrops are glistening like sweat on the oily skins of the great engines. Fire and water and steel combined in an elemental expression of national achievement. When the world still depended on steam and the railways, no one built better than this. The GWR grew out of the vision of one man, a vision of a level, broad gauge link between London and Bristol. In 1835, Isambard Kingdom Brunel was at 29 engineer to the new Great Western Railway.
The railway is now in progress. I am their engineer to the finest work in England. A handsome salary, £2,000 a year, on excellent terms with my directors, and all going smoothly.
What wasn't going smoothly was the locomotives. Brunel, brilliant as a civil engineer, was having less success as a locomotive designer. He badly needed someone else who could do it better. At the age of 20, Daniel Gooch applied for the job.
Manchester and Leeds Railway Office, Rochdale, July the 18th, 1837. Dear Sir, I have just been informed it is your intention to erect an engine manufactory and that you wish to engage a person as manager. I take the earliest opportunity of offering my services for the situation. I am anxious to engage myself to some company where I will have the management of the building of engines. I am, sir, yours obediently, Daniel Gooch.
Brunel was clear about the need for a principal engine establishment, a central engine station, Gooch was to call it. Its purpose:
to provide an engine establishment at Swindon commensurate with the wants of the company, where a change of engines may be advantageously made and the train stopped for the purpose of passengers taking refreshment.
It was Gooch who saw the virtues of building in the green fields of Wiltshire, where the line from Cheltenham met the route to Bristol. In 1841, a start was made on the works and a village to house the employees. Gooch had already designed his first GWR engine, and it worked well. 2 years later, Swindon was operational. Within months, there were 420 men on the payroll. In 1985, the celebration of the 150th anniversary of the beginning of all this was a reminder of what exciting times they were. Railways were changing the world. By the mid-1840s, Swindon was making the world's fastest trains. In 1847, the Iron Duke, recreated in replica for the anniversary, hauled passengers from London to Bristol in 2.5 hours. In another 2 hours, the traveller could reach Exeter. At Swindon, passengers were given 10 whole minutes to spend their money in the refreshment room. Brunel's broad gauge, more than 2 feet wider than everyone else's railway, reached into the west and north to Wolverhampton. The Swindon Works was by then employing 1,800 people. Most were to lose their jobs by the end of that year. Sudden redundancy isn't new, but eventually Swindon became one of the largest railway factories in Europe, with 14,000 people on the payroll. If the spirit of the Great Western Railway still survived, it would surely be here, and that was what I was looking for. Beyond the high-speed trains which still use Brunel's finest work in England, I began my search for that indefinable spirit. The main offices with their reminders over the door of Swindon's earliest years, the offices used by the great Swindon engineers. William Dean, in charge when the broad gauge was scrapped, his Agamemnon, one of the most elegant of Swindon products. George Jackson Churchward, who succeeded him. His Evening Star, built in 1907, is said to have been his masterpiece. Churchward's boilers, they say, influenced the whole world of locomotive engineering. And C.B. Collett, who followed Churchward, and whose reign at Swindon saw the creation of the legendary Castles and Kings. My search, then, began with a call on the head of personnel at Swindon, very much a man with GWR roots.
Ah, you must be Alan Martin.
Alan Martin's memories of the Swindon Works go back to the early 1940s, the war years. But he'd found for me a guide whose family association with the place went back even further, Ted Jeffries.
Ted, would you come in, please?
Alan's family is pure Great Western on both sides. He started in 1943 as a very junior clerk on less than £1 a week. They were hectic days.
Yes, we were doing our normal workload at that time, and the workers were working 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and that included bank holidays and usually at Christmas as well.
And a lot of the workshops given over to, as you say,
Yes, or part of the workshops, yes.
Ah, here it must be Ted.
Ah, yes, there's this Ted. Ted, this is Mr. Brown from the BBC. He's looking for the spirit of the GWR.
Follow me, let's see if we can find out.
Ted, I'll follow you.
Thank you, Mr. Martin.
Right over.
The last steam locomotive was built here in 1960, so the first surprise was to discover that most of the skills needed to repeat the golden age of trains that were Swindon built still survived. The announcement that Swindon must close altogether had yet to come. Outside, there's a new Swindon, owing nothing to the railway, but the memory of an all-powerful GWR is still rooted in the way Ted Jeffries views the town.
Yes, my wife's grandfather enjoyed telling us about the early days when his father walked from Highworth to Swindon, which is a distance of some 6 miles to come to work, starting off 10 to 4 in the morning and coming home at 10 past 8 at night. It's a long way, but it was slightly shortened because Brunel had the power and got the footpaths straightened out.
But he actually took a bill through
Parliament and got the footpaths straightened out. It just shows how powerful the railways were. This is one of the old relics of the past.
Great Western?
Oh, it's a Great Western, and it's a water tank that was pulled behind steam engines. And in the background there is the old gov van that was used for newspapers.
A couple of the last bits of Great Western rolling stock left.
This is the final bit.
Already it was evident that there was more of the GWR left at Swindon than a few rusting relics. This is how it looked in 1908. Replaced steam with diesel, and not much had changed by 1985. Men who had worked here 60 years before would find most of it still familiar. Many of the processes had not changed much either. Once there were 3 foundries in the Swindon Works. The one that remains is to survive, making non-ferrous bits and pieces for British Rail. Locomotive nameplates, for instance. British Rail all but did away with them at one stage until the marketing men restored them to favour. Hundreds of foundries in Britain have closed in the past few years. Along with the rest of the Swindon works, this one was due to close too. Then it was reprieved. So, here at least, the foundry men can go on applying their ancient skills, working up a thirst, and making their ironic comment on a changing world. The process begins even earlier in the pattern shop. Making castings requires patterns, and making a pattern still demands a mixture of craftsman and artist. Ever since Gooch, there had always been a new generation of craftsmen in the making at Swindon. In charge of both foundry and pattern shop was Alec Elliott.
It's an absolute Aladdin's cave of a place, isn't it? What have we got here?
Well, we've got about 19,000 different patterns for non-ferrous details. For instance, this, I mean, there's a...
What, that's a door handle?
That's a door handle, cast in yellow brass.
All the non-ferrous bits
and letters.
Oh, that's letters of a nameplate?
A nameplate, yes. So the old GWR type letters.
So you've got all the non-ferrous bits that are currently being used by British Rail?
That's right, yes. And they're used in our foundry, of course.
Does that mean that if you set out to do it, you could build another King George V in Swindon?
It would be very difficult to do that, actually, because we don't hold the patterns for the ferrous or for the steel, so consequently we couldn't quite reckon to do that. But we would have a go at it. But
now these are what? What are these? These are
yes, these are the old headboards that used to go on the steam locos. Do you remember those?
Gosh,
that's right. Yeah.
Stirred blood from here to
Cheltenham Express.
The other side of a There must be millions of people all over the world who would see something like that and they would think of what? Paynton and Saltash Bridge and Heberden Bank.
Yes, you can almost smell the smoke.
Yes. Cornish Riviera.
Many of those eagerly braving a wet Sunday to see the King George V associate the spirit of the GWR with Swindon's hallmark, distinctive trimmings of copper and brass. Like the big locomotive itself, which could throw grit in your eye and smut on your new hat, they may not have been very efficient, but the sight and sound and smell of it all surely symbolize mechanical power at its peak. And evidently, much of the skill and pride built into it still survives at Swindon. I'd begun to see why the Americans wanted to hang a bell on it in 1927. As for skill, imagine taking a sheet of metal and a soldering iron and making a tail lamp. And then watch Colin Bown. Not the sort of thing that will help us keep up with those clever Japanese, you may think. But clearly, the spirit of the GWR still survives in this corner of the works.
Oil-burning tail lamps. Why should anybody be making those in, what, 1985?
Well, presumably because they haven't found anything better yet. I should think so. I don't really know.
Do you remember making these for the Great Western?
Yes, when I was an apprentice, I worked on lamps in those days.
Has the pattern changed since then?
Very, very slightly. So there's a few alterations, structural-wise, but what's altered most is that we do more spot welding these days than we did in those days with all soldering.
Do you remember doing things for the old steam engines?
Oh, yes, yeah. So
what sort of thing?
One of the things that sticks out in my mind is on the nameplates. One of our jobs as apprentices was to put the brass beading that went completely round the shape of the nameplate, and that was soldered on, and I was to scrape the solder off after we finished, which was a laborious job. And all sorts of things on steam locos.
Great sense of pride in that, because you must have thought gosh, think of all those train spotters who are going to be collecting names like this. I mean, a lot of them are now collector's items, aren't they?
The nameplates themselves, yeah, but in those days you just don't think that way. I mean, you're just proud to be doing the job because it's a family tradition.
We made all the chimney tops and brass safety valve covers.
Now, they were a sort of GWR trademark, weren't
Yes, they were a distinctive feature of the Great Western locomotives.
But weren't they also a sort of apprentice's job?
Yes, apprentice did nothing else but the copper tops, the valve covers.
How long did that training take?
5 years, the coppersmith apprentice was.
What do you have to show at the end of it? You had your indentures,
Indentures, yes. I've still got mine signed by
those?
Mr. Collett. And my father's also have signed by Mr. Churchward.
It's very much a family tradition in your case, is it?
Yes, my father worked for the Great Western all his life, and my grandfather before him.
Were you born in Swindon?
I was born in the railway village itself, Southampton Street, so it is GWR stamped on me.
Look marvellous on an afternoon like this.
Oh, certainly do.
Presumably they were pretty basic when they were built.
Well, they were basic, but for the times they were very modern.
My guide was Alan Peck, engineer and author of the Standard History of the GWR at Swindon, another lifetime railway man.
Houses, they didn't have running water for 20 years, although there were standpipes for canal water in the streets.
Why did the GWR build them, but presumably not out of the goodness of their heart?
Oh, well, they had to be built. This was a greenfield project. The works were a mile and a half away from any habitations, so had to build houses before they could employ anybody here. So
the only way
of
actually getting people into work
yes,
here.
of course. They had to come from all over the country. The tradesmen were not available in this area, of course.
A bigger house on the end here. Who lived there?
Oh, C.B. Collett, one of the CMEs, lived there.
This is one of the chief mechanical engineers?
Yes, he lived there.
The GWR equivalent of living over the shop?
Oh, yes, exactly. Just that.
That's the museum now, isn't it?
Oh, yes, that's the museum. But, of course, it was originally built as a so-called barracks for the single men, with about 100 flatlets in.
Was it all about just providing somewhere for people to live?
Certainly not. It was very much a self-help organisation. Here, the cottage hospital, which was opened in 1872.
So it was a sort of, what, welfare state?
It was a welfare state, but run by the people themselves.
How much did this used to cost the people working here?
Oh, originally, between a penny halfpenny and 4p a week for married families, but even up to the time of the last World War, we were only paying about 1 and 4p a family. Well, this self-help, of course, didn't just apply to the medical side of the town. As early as 1843, a small library of about 100 volumes was got together by about 15 people. And the very next year, the Mechanics Institution was formed.
What do they do here?
Everything to do with the social life of the town and the further education of the men.
Presumably all this self-improvement had something to do with getting better jobs.
Oh, of course it did. Most people developed their careers by working at evening classes in this institute here. In 1849, the committee organised an outing to Oxford and with tongues in cheeks asked for free travel from the railway company, which, much to their surprise, they got. And this was perhaps the first use of free passes on the railway. This, of course, became an annual institution. And at the peak, which was around, I suppose, about 1930-32, up to 30,000 people would leave this town in about 30 trains. Many of them were specials to individual places like Weymouth, Weston-super-Mare and London. But the free pass was available to the workman and his family to anywhere on the Great Western Railway system.
That annual trip was welcome relief from this sort of work, operating a £1,000 drop hammer. Chippy Taylor, a blacksmith for 35 years, is, in his way, an artist. Having heated a billet of steel, he's now going to make a stanchion out of it for a railway wagon. He shapes the stanchion, adjusting the pressure of the hammer with his foot, instinctively coordinating hand and eye, in an operation that's a lot more delicate than it looks. As the metal cools, it gets harder to shape. With an apprentice as his second pair of hands, he's working against time. Legend has it that it was the test of an apprentice to do this with his watch, without breaking it.
These, I suppose, would have been made in the blacksmith shop here.
All the lot. In fact, every apprentice must make his own tools. He would make all the tongs that's required for his job, and if he gets a specialist job, he would have to design and make the tongs to suit that job.
So these are tongs, must have been other tools as well.
Oh yes, swages, flats at the back. He must make everything to suit the job that he's going to do.
All of that he learned to make in the 5 years
in his apprenticeship. Yeah.
Easy to argue, of course, that a 5 years apprenticeship doesn't make much sense in the Britain of the 80s. But I'd already met men who told me that a Swindon training was once the guarantee of a job almost anywhere. Show them your indentures and you could start Monday, they said. Will tomorrow's Britain have any use for a man who can make a drop hammer, dance and sing? The King George V was created for a world where neither railways nor good blacksmiths need doubt that they were needed. In August 1927, the first of Swindon's new kings went to America for the Baltimore and Ohio exhibition. The visit was a huge success. Britain's engineering skills seemed confirmed beyond argument. Railway enthusiasts, of course, know all about that American triumph. That's one reason why they were getting wet on Easter Sunday. Whatever else the letters GWR evoke, they surely include some assurance about a past with values yet to be challenged, about craftsmanship, of machines made to last, and timetables not easily broken. An assurance that today's nostalgia is more than just a way of healing our memories. One other thing I discovered. Half the workforce at Swindon seemed either to have worked for the GWR or had a father who did. Great Western ancestry for some goes back even earlier than that. British Rail might reasonably protest that millions have been invested here, but a lot of equipment still had GWR stamped on it, and there was still talk of working to GWR standards. Take the wheel shop. There are, of course, a lot of wheels on a train, and they all wear out. Railway wheels have tyres, steel tyres. Here they're replacing an old tyre and fitting a new one. Heat the old one so that it expands, cool the rest of the wheel, and the tyre comes off. Next, to fit a wheel with a new tyre that will also have cooked inside a gas ring for half an hour. No very great skill is involved, but the teamwork needs precision. Everyone must do his bit, spot on cue. It's hot and it's heavy. Similar teams have been doing much the same thing since Brunel's day. This wheel comes from a shunting locomotive. It must be set down in exactly the right place inside a new tyre, so hot that its inside diameter is just 3/16 of an inch more than the outside of the wheel. There's a flange to prevent the tyre from slipping. Afterwards, both will be left 16 hours to cool. In 1935, when the Great Western celebrated its centenary, the company chairman talked of team spirit. Brunel was, of course, remembered. The company seemed set for another 100 years.
The Great Western Railway has preserved not only its name, but its innate spirit and conscientious outlook. It is gratifying to feel that this sentiment permeates the whole system, and that all grades of the staff cherish it and take pride in the part which they play in this widespread organisation. It is this feeling of loyalty to our service, which is to us much less a machine and much more a living personality, that has earned the reputation which our railway enjoys today among the public. We, within our community, celebrate its 100th birthday with affection, and with an emotion charged with an ardent desire that it should flourish into far distant years, renewing its youth and its vigour at each successive stage of its progress.
The end was nearer than he thought. In 1948, the GWR was nationalised. Officially then, whether its spirit lived on or not, the GWR had been dead for 37 years when the 150th anniversary celebrations took place. It's one of the ironies of the 80s that they prompted more interest than the centenary of 1935. The magic of a big steam locomotive seems more potent than ever. We filmed for 3 days in May, not knowing that the following week British Rail Engineering would announce the closure of the Swindon Works by March 1986.